you're doing well. I'm still doing some recording here in Portland, trying to get ahead of things. So I hope you're doing well. I hope that you had a good holiday if it's past Christmas when you're watching this. And I hope you're planning on having a good New Year. So today I want to discuss a relatively short read. It's How to Blow Up a Pipeline by Andre Malm. I found this book interesting because, especially given the publishing timing that happened, which was 2021. So this was another one of the books that was influenced by the pandemic, since it was written beforehand. And I think that the ebook has edits that came out after the pandemic. And I think it's really interesting because this book was published before the BLM protests really took off, or it was sent to the publisher before then. And this book only has 3 chapters and a preface. It's 110 pages, that's just like a dissertation. It's not even really a book normally. So I'm really glad that it was published. I think it was by Verso. I think that it really punches above the weight of the length of the book. Despite the intentionally provocative title of the book, it is an incredibly thoughtful book about climate change, protesting generally, protesting climate change, and what to do when peaceful protests reach its limits, which I think is really important. And because, especially in context of the BLM, in context of some of the violence that we saw there, and what they were violent towards. Malm is a climate activist. He's been one since the 90s. He was at the original COP1 summit, COP1, the annual UN climate summit. For context, when I read this book just in early November, COP30 just happened. So in 30 years, we're still talking about literally the exact same stuff that Malm was protesting at the very first one. And really nothing has changed because of the COP30 or COP1 or any of them. All the limits that we had put in place, we just blew past. What Malm's really interested in is, why aren't we seeing more acts of violence against critical fossil fuel infrastructure given the failure of policy and protests? He attacks this in a few ways. First, by reviewing the largest climate protest group, the Extinction Rebellion. You might know them because they're the people who threw soup on a famous piece of art in the Louvre, or they're the ones who were doing the die-in across streets on highways and stuff. They're a pacifist protest organization, straight up nonviolent. And I would argue that throwing soup on that piece of art actually was an escalation, because that is destruction of a cultural artifact. Their founders are through and through anti-violence activists. They claim the only way to progress the climate cause is through nonviolence. And Malm just takes them to task. He reviews many of the people that we all think about whenever we look at nonviolent movement. MLK Jr., Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, all of them had nonviolent protests. But Malm tears all these down because one by one, he calls out the escalation that each one of these have had to do, or the way that they were able to avoid having violence in their rhetoric. And MLK had guns. He was not nonviolent. He had them to protect himself. He knew of people who had been lynched that were activists like him. So he took advantage of being able to purchase guns to protect himself. He also took advantage of the fact that he was not the only voice in the space, that he could position himself as a nonviolent alternative to someone like Malcolm X, and also allowed people who didn't think that MLK was doing enough to defect and go into the Malcolm X's group, or some other similar sort of the Black Panthers or something like that, and pursue something that could be potentially more violent or more active. And so there's kind of this balance between these two organizations. But even then, by the end of the life, King was both becoming more communist and was willing to commit more violence. And you actually kind of see that in the way that things are, the way people talk about him recede towards the end of his life, and likely the greater likelihood of him being assassinated. Gandhi's an interesting case because while he's a pacifist fighting the English Empire, he was all for fighting for empire. He was really pushing for Indians to fight in World War II, to fight in World War One, and to fight in all sorts of international colonial fights. And India was only made independent after World War II when England was giving up colonies everywhere. So Malm argues that it's like, is Gandhi really the reason that that it happened in India when it did? Sure, but he was not the only reason. There's probably a lot of other factors that went into it, including the fact that England could not handle empire anymore, and it was just collapsing them. And generally, there's a strong pushback against colonialism in general after World War II. And Nelson Mandela is just factually not nonviolent. He was a freedom fighter. He was put in prison for his violence. He recognized early on that nonviolent approaches wasn't working, and supported a radical group outside of like his direct influence. So like he did commit violence, and there was a violent group, but there was this separation of work, and I think that this makes it more successful and allows the reasonable people to push for more things, because you have an extremist group that is going way beyond pushing the Overton window very far, compared to this more rational, nonviolent group that is gradually following them in that direction. I really think that the inclusion of MLK in this book is important, especially because of the MLK protests that broke out in the 2020s. The violence that occurred in those protests pointed at only two things: cops and capital, especially the capital that worked with the incarceral state. Target was one of the buildings destroyed in Minneapolis. That was a site that was known for having just about everything locked down, community members regularly being misidentified by facial recognition, errors at the self-checkout, leading to frequent interactions with the loss prevention staff. And so, they were basically Target was part of the pipeline to lead people to prison. And so by destroying that, which the money was leaving Minneapolis, it wasn't staying locally. Sure, there was some money coming in from people working there, but most of the money was leaving the city because it was going to the shareholders of Target. Often during this time, MLK was brought out to tut the protesters, saying that he was horrified about what was happening, which at the time I thought it was a little convenient for Fox to do this. I mean, it was really kind of bullshit. They weren't using it in good faith, which again, you should not argue with people who are not using something in good faith. I would really go check out this FD signifier video. He really debunks a lot of those arguments in his deep dive into MLK. It's a really fantastic video. I really enjoyed it, and he definitely will give more context than I ever would about the entire civil rights movement, especially since his parents were involved in some of that. Malm takes care to define violence very carefully and clearly. He believes that committing sabotage or property damage is vandalism. Property damage as vandalism and an act of violence against that property, but he does not call it terrorism. Vandalism isn't terrorism, especially since the goal is to make sure that no one dies. Now, this is a specific behavior within the climate movement that he's talking about. There are people who are very actively going out of their way to make sure that nobody was there, that if there were security guards, that there was a distraction that pulled them away so that security guard didn't get hurt, and so nobody was injured. It was literally destruction of property, and that's it. As a form of protest. You know, he highlights two Catholic women who spent months sabotaging a major pipeline to ensure that it didn't work. They went from place to place to place and figured out where people were watching it and avoiding it to make sure that whoever was guarding it never got hurt. They did a bunch of different things, like destroying the pipeline itself, cutting through it, destroying the heavy machinery that was there, but no one ever got hurt. Despite this, they got charged with 110 years of prison for this, which, you know, they interfered with capital and the flow of oil, and that is an unconscionable crime in our world. These folks were proper Luddites. They were using the hammers of the day, or the hammers that they needed, to destroy the means of their oppression, and they were very successful at that. And now that we're on Trump 2.0, we're seeing massive protesting against him, like the No Kings rallies, which have been really huge. You know, we're talking 7 million people, but they haven't garnered a ton of press in the way that people would expect them. I mean, they're on Twitter and stuff like that, but it's not like they're plastered everywhere, not in the same sort of way that the Tea Party protests were. And there's also been a huge number of protests against ICE, and those have been growing, and people are really arguing against ICE using words, and ICE is escalating their violence. On November 29th, a mass of people stopped an ICE deployment in New York City, is essentially kettling the ICE. If you don't know, kettling is a crowd control mechanism where cops start pushing from one direction, and then at a cross street, another group of cops come from another direction, and they push protesters into another cordon of cops, so there's essentially no escape. And that's what happened with these protesters. They eventually surrounded ICE, so there was only one way to go, and that was back into their facility. And you know, this is the same sort of nonviolent action that a lot of climate activists have taken, stopping traffic on highways, stopping traffic in and out of refineries, stopping people from going into COP and things like that. I really do expect that ICE is going to escalate in the future if kettling becomes more and more popular. You know, they know that it worked. We know it worked. And they've already started to use vehicles in a way to fight against that these sort of kettling. There's some good examples of that. I'll post a couple of videos here.
The Broadview ICE facility has been the place of protests for many politicians running for public office, including progressive congressional candidate Kat Abu-Ghazala. Seen here in braids, she and 5 others have been indicted with a series of felonies related to a protest where she allegedly, quote, banged aggressively and pushed an ICE agent's vehicle.
But I really think that they're going to use it in a way that is going to drive through crowds, and I think that is going to be a point of escalation. And the American people are going to have to decide what they want to do when that happens, because people are going to die. And that's the point where Malm argues we can go two ways with the protesting. We continue to engage and continue to use the violence against the right targets in the right manner, or we can give in the fatalism. In the case of climate change, we've kind of seen a bunch of writers that have always been fatalistic and become more fatalistic. Basically, I can't change, and if I can't change, no one can change, so I may as well enjoy life as we burn everything down. Malm calls a couple writers out, Scranton and Franzen. Franzen is a popular novelist. And I think that we're also starting to see more and more right-wing talking points go to this direction, saying that they transition from climate change isn't real to climate change is happening, but it's not man-made. And now to, we're already past the tipping point, so we may as well continue on as what we're doing. And really, the talking points that someone like Franzen was using was just right-wing talking points, and then they just continue to co-opt him into the movement. Malm argues that we need to escalate, to push back against the fatalists. And we need to fight even if we lose. It's better to go down with a fight rather than not fighting. Human lives are worth it. Reducing suffering overall in the world is worth it. And even if it comes with a cost, fighting for freedom inspires the people that come after you. They may be successful where you failed.
Sure, I would have met you. Now it's a little late. What you could have taught me, I could have saved some face. They think that your early ending was all wrong. For the most part, they're right, but look how they all got strong. That's why I say, hey man, I shine.
And I think this is generally good advice for activists regardless of their goals. How we see the right doing this over and over and over again for decades. They did this with abortion rights. They're doing it with starting to do this with gay marriage and all that. We need to do the same thing that we believe in. If you can protest, go protest. If you can't, then try and support the people that are protested by bail fund or providing supplies for them while they're at the protests. They're protesting so we can have a better tomorrow. Have you read How to Blow Up a Pipeline? Do you have any thoughts about it? If you do, send some comments down below. If you liked what I had to say, feel free to subscribe and give me a like. I really appreciate you coming here, and I hope you have a good one.